So when you say social justice, we are not talking about the equal outcome of all groups. We are not talking about Ruslan should deserve to get paid what LeBron James gets paid to play basketball. That is not what we're talking about. So I just want to make this really clear. We are not talking about the disruption of meritocracy, the disruption of capitalism, the disruption of the nuclear family, and let's just create perfect outcome where we're going to disrupt and destroy our entire. That is not what we're talking about.
Right. Ruslan.
So let's talk about how opportunity has been prevented from certain groups in America. Because I think people just think, oh, there was like slavery and that like, you know, that was like 400 years ago, you know, and it's like, nope, slavery ended 150 years ago. And there's documentation of some people remaining functional slaves up until the 60s. You guys could look this up, okay? So so it's not just, hey, there's slavery and then civil rights, and then we just made everything perfect with civil rights. So let's unpack for those folks that are here. They're willing to give a lending ear. Let's talk about some of the things in between slavery into our modern context that have negatively, disproportionately affected the Black community.
No, that's a great point and question, because it's not just reparations for slavery. Okay, it is all of the things that happened after that as well. Now, slavery did build this country into the most powerful and wealthiest nation that we've ever known on earth. Okay, it was built on cotton, rice, tobacco, and sugar, which were the products of the slave trade and free labor for roughly 250 years. Okay, even the North benefited where there wasn't slavery, you know, after a certain period. Even it benefited because it was selling the South a lot of the stuff that was necessary for slavery, you know, from textiles, all types of stuff. So, but after slavery, because you mentioned how have some of the opportunities been kept from African Americans, it's also that so many opportunities, so many boosts, so much help was given to white Americans, including European immigrants. And that is the thing, like a lot of whites, you know, will feel like, well, we pulled ourselves up by our own bootstraps. And many did work hard. I'm not in any way saying white Americans have not worked hard for what they've gotten, but they've benefited from these boosts and these laws and things that worked for them while at the same time working against African Americans. So for instance, right out of slavery, and let me start this first. You know, of course, African Americans who had been enslaved were promised 40 acres and a mule out of slavery, because it's common sense that you don't just release a people who have been enslaved for 200 some odd years into society with nothing and expect them to be able to assimilate properly into that society. And so every African-American family was going to get 40 acres and a mule to be a part of this capitalistic society. And that never happened. In fact, the only form of reparations that happened for formerly in reference to the slave trade or slavery in America, was when slave owners in Washington, D.C. were actually paid as much as $300 per slave that they lost due to emancipation. So slave owners were
so we did have reparations in America.
Right, for what they lost when slaves weren't. Okay. And so in 1862, the beginning of the Homestead Act, that gave in the South and west of the Mississippi, it gave 270 million acres of land to 1.6 million mostly white families. This was the Homestead Act, and it was virtually for free. And the estimates today are that about 46 million whites are benefiting financially from the Homestead Act, which gave land to them for free. Okay, that's more than the entire population of African Americans in the country today. So there was the Homestead Act. Again, free land given to whites, including European immigrants, west of the Mississippi and also in the South. Then you go to the Social Security Act in 1935, where we know how beneficial Social Security is for everyone. Well, at that time, domestics and farmers were left out of Social Security. Most African Americans by far were either domestics working in the houses of white people as housekeepers or farmers. So that was a way to discriminate against African Americans without saying black. And so that worked mainly for whites and not for blacks. The Wagner Act, where unions were created, and we know the benefits of unions, Ruslan, you know, pensions, benefits, all of that stuff that unions give. They created the unions, but allowed the unions to discriminate against blacks and basically keep blacks out of the unions. So while whites were getting these benefits, blacks weren't. And then you go to the GI Bill after World War II from 1946 to 1952. Most white GIs received the benefits of the GI Bill, which was free education, free home, low interest home mortgages, all the benefits that come with the GI Bill. And yet most of the 2 million African Americans who had fought in World War II were denied those benefits of the GI Bill. Then you go to the Federal Housing Administration loans, okay, from 1934 to 1962. $120 billion of government-backed, low-interest mortgage loans were given to whites. 98% of the people that received these loans were white Americans. This is how we built the nice white suburbs here in America. And those suburbs had contracts or covenants that they called them, where they could not, even if you wanted to sell your house to an African American, you couldn't. Okay, low interest, government guaranteed loans to create the white suburbs. And yet, so blacks couldn't move into those suburbs. And then the black neighborhoods, on top of discriminating against blacks who wanted to move, they redlined the black neighborhoods, which meant that you couldn't, most families in those neighborhoods could not get home mortgages or home insurance. And if you did get it, the interest rates were sky high because of redlining. Yeah. It's been estimated that the average African-American family has lost $212,000 because of redlining. And so those are just ways that whites have been given advantages that blacks have not only been not given, but actually been discriminated against. Lastly, I'll say this, because a lot of people will mention affirmative action that began in the 60s, right? And I benefited from affirmative action, my family. My father was he was a college graduate, first in his family, in that first line of African Americans who were given corporate jobs. Now, he was qualified. He graduated with a business degree and all that. But he got a job in corporate America, and I benefited from that. Okay, but on the whole, affirmative action, which initially the thinking was this is for blacks to repair what the wrong that was done, it ended up being for blacks, other people of color, white women. And in fact, white women have benefited more from affirmative action than black people have. And white women tend to be married to white men. And so the white family overall has benefited financially from affirmative action more than the black family. And so those are all some of the post-slavery examples of benefits that whites have received that blacks in large part haven't.
Yeah, and the important part here is, for anybody that knows anything about financial literacy, microeconomics, the most direct path to building wealth is home ownership. Yeah. And if you have a history of a community being prevented from owning homes, it compounds over time. And we didn't even touch on the war on drugs and the cheap cocaine flooding, urban city streets, fairly well documented to fight an illegal war in South America against communism, and then mass incarceration, the war on drugs, over punishing. I mean, there's people in prison right now, doing 16 years for having 3 grams of crack on them today. There's over 3,500 people in prison today who have non-violent crimes. There are people in prison right now for selling weed in states where it's now legal to sell weed.
Right.
How does any of that make sense, right? So what I think the pushback
and let me
is,
say this,
go ahead.
Ruslan, quickly, not to cut you off.
Go ahead.
But what you're saying, what the combination of what I just said and what you just said, when you combine that with some of, like, again, the people that were applauding me early on in the podcast, right? You combine all of those aspects of the Bible because they're all biblically based. When you call out an unfair war on drugs, you're not being racial you're being biblically based. You're hungering and thirsting for righteousness. If we as a church as the whole spoke like that, then I believe we'd start a spiritual awakening. Really, that most of us want to see in this country. But because we're divided and half of us say this part and rail against the other part that's in the Bible, and half of us say this part and rail against the other part that's in the Bible, we're divided, and as Jesus said, a house divided can't stand.
Yeah, that's good. And by the way, guys, when we're talking about this, what the only picture I want people to understand is I am a free market guy. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm about empowering people through financial literacy, through education, through technology. The point that we're making is that there have been different pathways based on history. And if you think that the situations today just happen in a vacuum and that policies from 60 years ago or the 1980s don't affect people today, I think is just astonishing to think that there's no connection to what happens generationally. And so let's talk about the biblical reasons, because I think a lot of people are gonna be like, that's fine, Chris, but how do you justify this scripturally? And then I want to talk about some potentials of how, because the how people get in the weeds on the how, and there's all kinds of hows. So talk about some of the just the scriptural framework of what restorative justice means.
And before I get there, let me give you this, because a lot of people, which is understandably, will look at African Americans, even look at myself and say, well, Chris is doing fine. He's on TV, he's making money, all this and that. But as you said, the generations, things that happened in the past affect us today. And all the things I mentioned, and then some, have created a wealth gap between black and white, where the average white family has 8 times more wealth than the average black family. And as you said, that's generationally. That's not based on income. That's based on generation. When my parents die, I will, because they own their house, I'll benefit from that. And that will benefit my children. That's building wealth. And so it's not just based on income. And then here's the last thing. A white family in America led by someone who has nothing more than a high school diploma has more wealth than a black family on average led by someone with a master's degree. So that's where you show you can make a lot of income, but if you don't have wealth, then it's going to be hard for you to handle the hardships of life, a pandemic, losing a job, things like that. So that is one critical thing today where we've been affected by the past. And that's what we'd like to, the thing, reparations would go a long way in helping in that regard. But as far as the biblical case for reparations, there's no doubt it's there. I mean, we could start with the New Testament story of Zacchaeus and how Zacchaeus, we know he became a Christian, he got saved. And he said to Jesus, look, I'm paraphrasing, but I'm following you now, Lord. And I've, as proof, if you will, all the people that I've wronged, I have gone back and I have given them not only what I took from them, but 4 times that amount. And Jesus said, in reference to what Zacchaeus said, today salvation has come to you. So he was saying, this is fruit. You're bearing fruit now of your salvation. So that's one individual example. But you go to the Old Testament, and in Exodus chapter 12, when the children of Israel are leaving Egypt, God tells them, tells Moses to go tell the Egyptians that you want articles of silver and gold and clothing when you leave. You can't just go out of here empty-handed. They have to give you stuff so you can survive and begin to build your nation up. And in verse 36 of Exodus 12, the Bible says the Lord caused the Egyptians to give the children of Israel the reparations, or the articles of silver and gold that they asked for. In Deuteronomy chapter 15, it talks about when Hebrew men and women were enslaved, that you have to, when their slavery is over, their term, if you will, 6 or 7 years of working for you is over, don't send them away empty-handed. It says, give them liberally, supply them liberally from your flock, from your threshing floor, from your wine press, so that they can go out and again start a new life, if you will, with good opportunities and the things they need to do this. And this is Hebrew slaves. Now you'll notice, Ruslan, there were laws that Christians couldn't enslave Christians for whites.
Mm-hmm.
But once it became race-based chattel slavery in America, they ended those laws and said, no, you know what? Christians can't enslave other Christians. That will get you saved and get your soul to heaven, but it won't impact your station here on earth as a slave. And so that's another example. You can go to Numbers chapter 5, where it talks about, any man or woman who's wronged another. They have to go back and make full restitution for the wrong that they've done. And in fact, add 1/5 of the value to it to give to the people that you've wronged. Proverbs 14:9 says, fools mock at making reparation, but there is goodwill among the upright. So all of those are just some biblical examples, Ruslan, where the Bible promotes this notion of reparations. We know in Matthew, I believe it says, if your brother has aught against you, don't go and, give to the Lord, but instead go back and make amends with your brother and then come and give to the Lord. So those are a few examples.
I think the pushback then becomes, well, Chris, why do white people today have to pay for something their ancestors did? And I think this is where people will miscategorize and take some of the, I would call, poor anti-racist training, and then they become anti-racist because they read a chapter from Robin DiAngelo's book. And so what we're not talking about is, we're not talking about white shame. We're not talking about white guilt. We're not talking about taking money out of white people's pockets and giving it to black people. That is not what we're talking about. There are corporations, quite a few of them around today, that were benefiting and built from chattel slavery 150 years ago. That's just a fact. So there's banks, and you guys can look this up. Look up corporations around today that benefited from chattel slavery.
Today. Yeah.
Most of the banks
Fargo,
today.
JP Morgan, either them or their predecessor banks benefited from slavery.
Yeah, so when we talk about this, I don't think the heart of this is, hey, any white people should feel ashamed and guilty because your ancestors could have done this or whatever. I think it's to say, hey, there are these disparities that are historical that have played out and created very different outcomes for a group of people that have been discriminated against and other groups of people that weren't. And a lot of times we also got to be careful with what about other minorities? I just want to say this real quick, Chris. When you're talking about other minorities, or if we compare folks from Jamaica or folks coming from Ghana or folks you have to factor in that you're getting some of the best of people that literally are able to afford to immigrate here, and that they're crushing it because you're not just getting average or lower class. You're getting some of the brightest, smartest people immigrating here. So yes, they are going to outperform.
I'm not trying to make any white people feel guilty. This is not about that at all. And I agree, it's not about white shame. It's not about white guilt or anything like that. It's just about a fact in this country. Now, we're unique. You talk about the Holocaust, which took place obviously in Germany, and Jews over here, they're out of the country. They're not at the quote unquote scene of the crime. Mm-hmm. We're in a country where Black Americans who were enslaved here, the descendants are still here. And so it's a unique experiment that America is trying. And so we're saying, let's try to fix this racial issue once and for all. And I think one of the things that reparations provides is closure. Because I think blacks and whites want closure on this thing. Like, we want to be able to move on. Like, look, the race issue isn't, let's move past it. And I get it that there are other things. I mean, there are many types of reparations, you know, you can look at, programs, cash checks, whatever. But I'm saying if reparations is accompanied by teaching the truth in schools, by you know, other opportunities, like for instance, today, predominantly white school districts in America receive $23 billion more for their education than predominantly black or school districts of color. $23 billion more. And let's face it, most of the predominantly white school districts are out in nice neighborhoods, most of them, not all, but in white suburbs where they're nice neighborhoods and the people have more money. And most of the black or people of color school districts are in more poor neighborhoods. So people who already have advantages and economic advantage are getting a better education. And so that's even more of an advantage. And look, my kids, obviously I'm doing well. I trained my kids to tutoring for SAT prep and all that. And it wasn't fair. My kids went to elite schools, got tutoring for their SAT. And I know when I was a kid, I rolled into the SAT on Saturday morning with no training, nothing. I just took it off the cuff. And so it's not fair. So my point is, that's something else that needs to be rectified. So I think it should be equal money spent on education regardless of where you live or what your economic status is in public schools. Now, so I think to your point, it's not about white guilt or shame, and it's not about taking money from individual whites. To me, it's about the government, and it's about individual, as you mentioned, corporations, which could do things. White banks that had benefited from slavery could give some of their money to black-owned banks or give more loans to African Americans and African Americans businesses. And you say, well, the credit for some of these individuals is so bad. Well, yeah, when you live in check to check for generations, yeah, your credit's probably going to be bad. And so we need to make, you know, allowances for things like that. And then you go to schools. Most of the schools in the Ivy League, most American schools that were created before the Civil War benefited from slavery. So let's say Harvard, for instance. Harvard has an endowment, and has admitted it benefited from slavery, has an endowment of $40 billion. That's 13 times the endowment of all 100 plus historically black colleges and universities in the country. They have an endowment of roughly $3 billion. Harvard has $40 billion. What if Harvard just gave 3% of its endowment to, say, Howard University, one of the top HBCUs? That in and of itself would be huge, and that would allow Howard to become an even greater school. If Yale gave 3% to Spelman, now Harvard would still have $37 billion, so you're going to be fine. But this is repairing the damage that was done. Those are a couple of examples that wouldn't harm white individuals.
Kingstream Entertainment. Ruslan.
Hey, thank you so much for making it to the end of this video. If you found it valuable, please consider giving it a like and subscribing. You can check out one of the other videos related to this that'll be over here. Now, I gotta tell you about a free training I have for anyone that is an entrepreneur, a creative, an artist, but maybe you are unsure on how to find your voice, how to find your niche. I have a free training in the description of this video. Check it out. Once again, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you, and I will see you on the next video.